I'm so excited to have Nolan Huizenga back with us. And you can see up here in this square right here that Nolan is with us by Zoom this morning. As you may have heard last week, Nolan is a pastor he's Reverend Nolan Huizenga. He is not a doctorate as we gave him honorarily last week. But Nolan is a pastor who's serving in Louisville, Kentucky as the transitional pastor of Highland Presbyterian Church. Before that, if we go back many years, he grew up in Houghton, New York, which is a small town in Western New York, or Northern New York, and Northwestern New York.
Western, yep.
And he was in IT for a long time, which has made him a wonderful partner for all this technology that we're doing. He has served churches in New Jersey, in Raleigh at White Memorial Presbyterian Church, where he was a colleague of Anna Dixon. He's also been in Nashville, and as I said, now he is in Kentucky. One of the things that Anna said last week is that Nolan's spiritual gift is friendship. And I feel like after 1 week of meeting you and after multiple emails, I have a new friend in Kentucky.
You do.
Excellent. Thank you for concurring. So we're just delighted to have you back, Nolan, and appreciate your taking time. He will go from here to preaching in just a moment. So he's wearing many hats this morning. So Nolan, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gerald. I appreciate the very warm hospitality that First Presbyterian has shown last week and ongoing. Friends, the peace of Christ be with you all. Thank you. Anything I would have wanted to give you as intro, Gerald has beautifully done. So I am indeed serving here at Highland Presbyterian in Louisville. You can see the empty shelves behind me. I am a transitional pastor here. It's unclear how long I might be here. Happy to serve in this capacity for now. So I may over time fill up these shelves, but I'm slowly bringing books from my home office. I have not yet transported everything over. It's an honor to be here and serving this community of Christ as well. And also, I'm glad that, Gerald, you recorded last week and made that available. I'm not going to try to repeat what we did last week. It was an invitation into the emotional life of Jesus, partly through artwork, partly through the resonances of how Jesus's emotional life has been portrayed in our artistic and popular culture. I invite you to go back and watch that if you're interested. And that was a way to get us to start thinking about the gospel stories, which is, of course, where we get any window into the emotional life of Jesus. So here we are in week 2. I'm going to go ahead and go back to sharing my presentation here. I will probably go back and forth between sharing slides and then stopping for us to be able to talk. It's easier to see your faces if I don't have the slide sharing up. Can you see that slide?
Yes.
Okay, so here we are, week 2. The emotional life of Jesus is the overall series, 3-week series. And today we are going to be exploring what it means to look at these stories. How do we pay attention to the stories that we've been given? And of course, they're in the Gospels. These are stories that reveal some of Jesus' emotional depth. And so some of our, this week and next week, some of our time will focus on individual stories or overall senses through the Gospels of what we get of emotions going on in and around Jesus. So I'll invite us up front to pay attention not only to what may be happening inside Jesus in his own emotional state, but what happens to the people around him? What are their reactions like? How are their feelings being accepted, adapted, worked with by Jesus himself? At the end of last week's class, we looked briefly at one story as Jesus is calling the disciples, and he meets Nathanael, who up front is really resistant. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Jesus beautifully deflects and reorients that question and gives Nathanael a compliment about his honesty and moves on to invite him to follow. And Nathanael says, "You are the Christ, you are the Lord, I'll follow you." So that kind of emotional intelligence of not reacting in a way that many of us might is a model that Jesus gives us for how to be in community. So that was one story we looked at last week. This week, I'd like us to look at several others. We also talked last week about the constellation of emotions that are represented in the Gospels of Jesus, his emotions, and also the people around him. So it's not only the feelings that we might most expect, but I'm going to start out with one that we probably do most expect: love. And the reason I'm starting with this is because love is not only an emotion, but it is a state of being. And in my understanding of who Jesus is, love propels him in everything that he does, whatever else is going on. And that starts with his relationship with God. So here are a number of stories or references that just highlight that love is a primary foundation for Jesus in his life. That first one from Matthew 3, you probably remember what that scene is. A voice from heaven said, "This is my son whom I dearly love. I find happiness in him." To me, that shows that whatever love is in Jesus is coming directly from his connection with God. It's divine love that is propelling all that Jesus chooses to do. So he feels loved. He is part of the divine love that is expressed in the world. So his own sense of mission comes out of that. Anybody know what that second one from Mark 10, that phrase, Jesus looked at him carefully and loved him? Do you remember what story that's from?
This young ruler?
Yeah. Yes. So here's somebody who is having a hard time with a challenge that Jesus gives him. You lack only one thing. Give all your possessions to the poor and come follow me. So that's an incredibly hard challenge, period. But then Jesus doesn't reject him for his inability to do that at that moment. Jesus looks at him and loves him. There's a beginning point, a beginning orientation that is love. And I brought that one up partly because to look carefully at something for a long time or someone for a long time is to contemplate. That's what contemplation is. So Jesus contemplates this rich young man and loves him in all of his complexity and messiness. And whether or not he can follow the challenge that Jesus gives him at this time, he at least gets a look of love from Jesus that probably is transformative in whatever ways. So then let's move down to the third one in John 11. There are the complications with family that, like all of us experience, Jesus certainly experiences.
What?
And so at one point, Jesus's siblings and his mother hear what he's preaching and telling people, and they think this guy's gone off his rocker. We got to go collect him, get him into some therapy and help, and take him away. So Jesus at that point says, when he's told that they're coming looking for him, he says, all right, who are my mother and my sisters and brothers? And it turns out for Jesus, it's his chosen family, those who wish to be in community with him and wish to follow him. And maybe the best example of that chosen family for Jesus is Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. I hope you remember some of those stories where Jesus not only is with them at home and shares meals and deep conversation and love, but also when Lazarus dies, there's a lot of emotional content in that story. And we're going to come back and look in detail at that one. As Jesus is getting ready to end his ministry and leave his life, there's a long discourse in John where he is basically saying a long farewell to his disciples. And he again emphasizes his connection of love with God his connection of love with the disciples coming out of that, and then their mutual connection of love together. This is something that is a huge theme in the Gospel of John, and especially that closing discourse as Jesus is saying farewell and trying to equip them for life and moving forward when he's gone. Love is the dominant theme. Of course, there's Peter, who has denied Jesus before his crucifixion, and this redemption scene for Peter is Jesus asking him repeatedly after his resurrection, "Do you love me? Do you love me?" And for us, probably if someone asks that repeatedly, it makes us a little squirmy. Like, why do you keep asking me if I love you? Isn't it clear, or am I doing something wrong? But Jesus probes Peter 3 times with that. And we can talk about what that is like for both of them in that moment. But it's clearly dominated by love, that question. And finally, the last thing I'll mention about Jesus' love is he has a whole slew of teachings on love, including what I would say is the hardest commandment of all: love your enemies. I don't know about you, but it is very difficult for me to do that. And it is maybe the deepest challenge in the gospel that Jesus offers us. But it comes out of the love that propels him and everything in his ministry. And he actually, the real kicker to love your enemies is Jesus, through his life and at the end of his life, even under torture, he lives that out. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. That is, to me, one of the biggest challenges we can face as Christians, to try to love our enemies. All right, so that's a relatively simple one that we expect from Jesus, love. So that's probably not a surprise. But let's move on to something different. We're going to look at this story in more detail. I'm sorry that I don't know which painter did this scene of Jesus and the Canaanite woman or Syrophoenician woman. If one of you knows who the painter is, that's great. I somehow didn't get that as I prepared this. But this story is in Matthew 15. If you have a Bible with you, or there are Bibles in the room, pull one out. I'm also going to, or if you have one in your home, where you are on Zoom, then go ahead and do that. I'll also put the text up on the screen here. Can you see that? I don't know if in the room that is easy enough to read on the screen. This is Matthew 15, 21 to 28. I will invite someone either in the room or on Zoom to read the story out loud for us. And then I'll read it again after that. I think hearing it a few times is going to be helpful for us to get into this. So I'll invite anyone who volunteers to go ahead and read the story clearly so we can all hear it. Anybody willing? I know you all can read.
I'll do it.
Thank you.
From there, Jesus went to the regions of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from those territories came out and shouted, "Show me mercy, son of David. My daughter is suffering terribly from demon possession." But he didn't respond to her at all. His disciples came and urged him, "Send her away. She keeps shouting out after us." Jesus replied, "I've been sent only to the lost sheep, the people of Israel." But she knelt before him and said, "Lord, help me." He replied, "It is not good to take the children's bread and toss it to dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall off their master's table." Jesus answered, "Woman, you have great faith. It will be just as you wish." And right then her daughter was healed.
Thank you. I'll read the same story again, and I'll invite you to continue listening for what is the emotional content in this story. Where are there emotions that, or as you hear it, where do you imagine or feel anything emotional from any of the characters? So one more time, here's Matthew 15. From there, Jesus went to the regions of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from those territories came out and shouted, "Show me mercy, son of David. My daughter is suffering terribly from demon possession." But he didn't respond to her at all. His disciples came and urged him, "Send her away. She keeps shouting out after us." Jesus replied, "I've been sent only to the lost sheep, the people of Israel." But she knelt before him and said, "Lord, help me." He replied, "It is not good to take the children's bread and toss it to dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall off their master's table." Jesus answered, "Woman, you have great faith. It will be just as you wish." And right then her daughter was healed. As you hear this story, and as it settles into us, and we've heard it twice now, where do you feel any kind of emotional resonance in these words? What are the people experiencing or feeling in this story?
In verse 24, rejection.
Who's being rejected?
The non-Israelites.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, Jesus. Go ahead. Were you going to say more?
The Gentiles.
Yeah. Yeah, Jesus is pretty clear that he's been sent to his people Israel. That's his mission. What else?
Well, there's certainly desperation for the Canaanite woman.
Right. Yeah.
Irritation by the disciples.
Yeah. Irritation, impatience. Yeah, they seem to just want to be done with this.
I'm reading the message by Peterson and.
Great.
It says she's driving us crazy.
That's how he renders that. She's driving us crazy.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. By the way, I really like reading the message. This is Eugene Peterson's translation / paraphrase of the scriptures. It's really vivid. As a side note, sometime go read the Lord's Prayer in the message translation. It will make you pray that in a whole different way, I think. Other places in this story where you feel like there's emotional content or an implicit feeling behind the words.
Well, I was surprised on Jesus' part where, I hadn't thought of that, where the dogs eat the crumbs that fall off the table. It goes, "Oh, you have great faith, you're right."
Yeah. Yes. I actually love that about this story. Does it make us a little uneasy for Jesus to be surprised or not? It might depend on whether we perceive him as, a sort of all-knowing and placid about everything, or as really a human being like us who learns and grows and encounters change in his life. I think that last verse really does have surprise in it. I might even call it astonishment. And I think possibly that starts a little bit earlier in the story too, because here's this woman who is not one of the children of Israel. She's from a perceived outsider status, but she kneels in front of Jesus and calls him Lord. She sees something in him that is not only needing respect, but maybe that's almost worshipful. And for an outsider to do that might have been the first surprise in the story. And I appreciate that somebody said, pardon, go ahead.
I think she shows a lot more emotion in the text than we're interpreting, because I think in addition to her desperation, she's hopeful.
Yeah.
She's hopeful, and it may be because she's so desperate that she's hopeful that this guy can do what others have said about him, that he has the power to heal.
Right. Which I think you just said, she also had faith. I mean, no wonder Jesus acknowledges that. That's the demonstration of faith. Yeah, that's very powerful. Which means she also converts or orients her desperation into faithfulness, putting it in a direction that she trusts, hopes, yearns for healing for her daughter, that she hopes this will happen, and goes to Jesus with that orientation. And she does get ultimately what she asked for. So there probably at the end of the story for her, there might be great joy and relief that however we understand demon possession, her daughter has now been relieved of that. So her life is changed by this encounter. I think that sense of surprise and astonishment on Jesus's part, I would go so far as to say, I feel like his life is changed by this encounter also. Up to this point in Matthew, he's indeed been focused on his people Israel. That's the orientation of his mission, to come to Israel, preach the coming kingdom of God, be with those people in those towns. But if you read the gospel after this, Jesus is reoriented to being more open to the Gentiles as well. And I think that maybe we could say his sense of mission, of what he was here for, or who should be the recipients of his grace and preaching and healing, that might have expanded by this encounter. And I think that starts with astonishment that in this supposedly foreign woman, there is faith in the God of Israel as represented in Jesus. So his astonishment, I think, makes his mission yet larger. I'm not here only for Israel, but for the good of the world. So I like that she was insistent enough that her daughter be healed, that it maybe broke open attention from Jesus to other Gentiles as well. Maybe we are the long-term recipients of her persistence. I appreciate that a lot. One other place where Jesus shows astonishment, and you may think of others as well, but remember when the Roman centurion confronts him in the street, asks for his servant to be healed. He says he's near death, and Jesus, in their conversation, the centurion eventually says, I don't even need you to come to my house, just say the word and he'll be healed. And Jesus, once again, is astonished by the faith of this Gentile person. So I think great faith is not restricted only to the people that we think it's going to be in. And even for Jesus, he encounters these surprise, faithful people, or at least people desperate for healing of someone else, which to me does seem like an act of faithfulness. So that story is in Luke 7. You can read that one later. Are you ready? Any other thoughts about this story, or should we move on to another one? Okay. So let's look at another story. This one is profoundly famous, one of the more famous ones in the Gospels. This is an El Greco painting of Jesus cleansing the temple, taking the money changers and all of the transactional apparatus out of the temple, chasing out the sheep and the goats and all of that. Get these things out of here is the sort of dominant theme. What I wanted to, I don't know if you can see it there on your screen, but the look on Jesus' face in this painting, he's right in the center with his whip of cords over his shoulder. the look on his face is almost crazed. And there's a passionate intensity to the way the artist has portrayed this, which may not be how we generally perceive Jesus on a Sunday morning in our churches. So let's look at this story a little bit as well. Somebody else from the group, either on Zoom or in the room, would be willing to read this one? And again, we'll hear it twice. Thank you.
We start with what, 13?
13, yeah, 13 to 16.
When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found men selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. Those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. How dare you turn my father's house into a market?"
Thank you. Again, we're listening for the emotional content here, emotional resonances, either in Jesus or in the people around him in the story. Would one other person be willing to read it? And it doesn't matter if you have a different Bible version, that's fine. Let's hear it a second time.
And the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem and found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overflowed through the tables, and said unto them that sold doves, "Take these things hence, make not my father's house a house of merchandise."
Thank you.
That's King James Version.
Yep. It's great for us to hear different English translations. The wordings are a little different, and I think each of those different word choices that translators make gives us a little bit different emotional feel to it as well. It's worth reading multiple translations always in Bible study. Thank you both for reading.
You're welcome.
I had a college professor, a sociology professor, who used to say, if someone stomps on your toe and you don't scream, something's wrong. If there is pain or hurt in our lives and we're not able to express a yelp of, "Oh no," or "ouch," or "that's terrible," or "stop that," maybe we're not healthy emotionally. We're trying to repress that, and of course, as we know, if we repress whatever kind of pain we have, it's going to come out later in some other way, usually not healthy. So it's worth maybe developing the ability to yelp when something has gone wrong. Here's another quote from a 19th century Presbyterian minister and scholar, B.B. Warfield. He used to teach at the earlier version of Princeton Seminary. It's kind of a big name in the church in the 19th century. He said, so this is a pretty conservative guy, more than any of us would be comfortable with theologically, probably today, but also deeply faithful and interested in studying the scriptures in profound ways. So B.B. Warfield said in his book on the person and work of Christ, he said, it would be impossible for a moral being, someone who's moral, to stand in the presence of perceived wrong and be indifferent or unmoved. It's impossible to stand in the presence of wrong and be indifferent or unmoved. Well, in this text, Jesus is anything but indifferent. All right, let's do the same exercise of what are the emotions going on here as we interpret them, as we hear this story. What do you hear?
You know, one of the things that is not specifically in this text, but you can imagine preceded it was a buildup of, Jesus's head was full of what he knew was before him. And so I think lots of times we respond, we quickly and, maybe fly off the handle when we're preoccupied or have heavy things weighing on us. So again, it's not the text, but it's sort of, you could imagine his coming to the space of the market and just snapping quickly.
That's really helpful, Gerald. Thank you. That in all of our emotional lives, including for Jesus, it's rarely that there's an emotion that's only about this one moment. It usually has history and experience behind it. And you're right, maybe he already has felt so much pain and rejection from either the people around him or even his own disciples sometimes. This is early in his ministry in John, but in the other Gospels, this scene happens at the end of his life in that last week in Jerusalem. So there's interesting decisions of the Gospel writers where to place this. But yeah, there might be a whole lot more going on in his inner life than just, oh, this bothers me that people are selling things in the temple. And maybe that propels the anger. So I appreciate that a lot.
It's not so much to me a snap reaction when it says he made a whip from ropes and chains. I mean, that's sort of methodical there. I mean,
You're
I can
right.
see them doing that. In fact, again, Peterson said Jesus put together a whip out of strips of leather. I mean, it's more than just picking up something and reacting like I would do, sometimes.
It's also probably not the first time he encountered.
What was that last thing? I couldn't hear it.
It was the first time he encountered the marketplace.
Oh, right. Yeah, maybe. So those are both really important ideas. He takes time to respond, at least to prepare the tool he's going to use to chase out the animals and the people. And maybe he's seen this multiple times and he's finally reaching a breaking point. We don't know. The gospel writer doesn't tell us that, but it could well be, which helps me as I understand this scene. It may not be that just Jesus has terrible impulse control. It might be this was the thoughtful, premeditated response to a real problem. We don't know, but I think the fact that we have that little indication he took time to make the whip makes sense. Notice also it doesn't say, sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand that this was kind of standard operating procedure in the temple. This is not a farmer's market.
That's right.
Those animals are, or it started out anyway, were for sacrifice.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't, I mean, the way I see it, I think it had been going on for over 1,000 years. And like so many things had been corrupted.
That is completely right. If you go back to Leviticus to read the procedures about what sacrifices looked like in the temple, it is a bloody mess. And there's an awful lot of violence that happens as part of that sacrificial system. And yes, the money changing was to try to keep more pure the purchase of sacrifices. You were using temple money instead of the regular currency from the day. And yes, it's been going on for a long time, which gives us another whole layer of resonance to this story. Jesus is not just stopping transactions in the temple or stopping it because there's a business problem. I think he's actually throwing a wrench into that entire sacrificial system and saying, we don't need to do this anymore. That's a bigger interpretation than many people might be willing to go with, but at least for that day, he completely gums up the works of that whole sacrificial system. So that's worth exploring as well. What does this mean for the temple? And indeed, not too long after Jesus' death and resurrection, the temple sacrifices were ended permanently. There are a lot of reasons for that, including Rome coming in and crushing Jerusalem again. But it is worth our attention that Jesus, at least for a day, stops this whole thing and sends the animals off into the street instead.
It also
Um,
gives you a different impression. Sorry.
Yeah, please.
It also gives you a different impression in your mind's eye of the physical appearance of Jesus. I mean, in this scene, we think, at least, I think typically we think of him as sort of slender and, and slight, but here he comes across as an imposing appearance to overturn those tables and to drive the animals out.
Yeah.
It's quite the El Greco portrait does a good portrayal of that, but yeah, it's startling.
It is.
Well, Nolan, just following up on your comment, if this is, this kind of throws, I mean, your comment, if you take it to, the extent that you can, kind of throws a different message. I mean, a different picture on this emotional interpretation, because it could have been just the fulfillment of his ministry. In other words, okay, we don't need after this week, guys, we ain't gonna need to be doing this.
Right.
And he had no anger whatsoever, because he was sending a message that, and so he wasn't angry. It's kind of, he had to do what he had to do, and it's in this message. And if, you can certainly interpret it that way.
That's really interesting, Joe. Thank you. It might be that if we took it as a sort of theological shift in the life of Judaism and of what Jesus is revealing about God, possibly we could read it as this is not an act of anger. I think personally, I feel like it's probably both and. There's a theological shift that's at least foreshadowed here in how we approach God, and we don't have to sacrifice creatures or people to please God, where Jesus is doing something different to make right our relationship with God. But also, it's hard for me to think there's no anger in this. I think to toss over tables is a pretty, like William was saying, it's a pretty violent, vigorous response. So it makes me think this gospel story disrupts our ability to see Jesus as a wise, humble teacher. I mean, he's not safe or responsible. He doesn't form a committee to address this problem. He goes to work. And I always try to picture, what would this be like in my church if Jesus came in and flipped over the communion table and said, you're doing it all wrong, get these things out of here. Or threw the offering plates on the ground. This is not what church is about. What would we do? It at least shows us that there is a different kind of challenge in the person of Jesus than we might want even. I think it's easy for us to domesticate him instead. So that's a rich and ongoing story. It's one of the ones, not the only one, but it's one of the stories in which Jesus.
I was gonna say, this has nothing to do with John, but years ago, my late father, college English professor, put on a play with the Abraham Isaac sacrifice story.
Yeah.
It was really interesting.
Yes. Well, so there's another one of those where there's a lot of emotional content that's not written out like, and Isaac felt like this, but as we read the story and pay attention, what is that like to be nearly sacrificed, or to think that your life is about to end because your father is doing it, because he thinks that he's being faithful? That's complicated. I can picture Isaac in a lot of therapy for years after that.
Yeah, Abraham was being tested.
Right. Right. I appreciate you bringing that in. I was just going to say that this is not the only story in which Jesus shows anger. There are others, and Father Jim Martin, I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He is what Stephen Colbert used to call the chaplain to the Colbert Nation. And Stephen Colbert is famously a Catholic. Jim Martin is a wonderful public theologian and public voice in the Catholic Church. He's a Jesuit. He wrote a beautiful article a number of years ago on what he calls the furious mysteries. These mysterious times when Jesus gets angry. And I'll give you the link to that article. It's available readily online, and Gerald can share it with everybody. It's beautiful because it helps us grasp, okay, what kind of anger is Jesus showing? It's not destructive of relationships, but it is a righteous anger on behalf of the world becoming a better and different place, and awakening to the presence and love of God in the world. So I'll share that article with you. It's a helpful thing for me to have read. And some of those others are like when Jesus kind of out of the blue curses a fig tree and it withers and dies. That seems strangely angry. Why did he do that? Even when he tells Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," that's at least a very pointed comment to call somebody Satan. So whether you read that as anger or not, it's at least there's a kind of fury there. And maybe even in that first story we looked at with the Canaanite woman, when he implies that she is one of those foreign dogs, that's at least dismissive and maybe downright sort of angry, like, get away from me. But she, as we see, persists. So, okay, there's a lot to open us up to there about Jesus and his relationship with anger, especially righteous anger. Let's look at one more emotional theme here. Anybody know who this is? That's blues guitarist and singer Buddy Guy. And if you've never gotten to hear him play live, it is worth your time. In 2005, Buddy Guy was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I happened to see that speech that he gave when he got his induction award. And one of the lines in there is, Buddy Guy says, "If you don't think you've got the blues, just keep living." And good Lord, did that stick with me. I thought, oh yeah, we're all getting the blues if we don't have them now. It's coming for all of us. And so I really appreciate that simple, this is why we have the blues moment that Buddy Guy brings us. So does Jesus get the blues? One of the stories that I think reveals that most clearly, and that we'll look at least briefly here, is when Jesus wept and when he is standing at his friend Lazarus's grave. Now, you notice these little Lego figures. There is a guy who put together what he calls the Brick Testament. He did this years ago. You can go to this website, and there's a whole bunch of Bible stories that are told visually with Lego characters. They've done this beautifully. So we're actually, partly for fun, going to go look at the Lego version of Lazarus. Let me bring this up and give me just a second, and I'll share it with you. All right, I'm going to share my screen again. Yeah, you can see that, right? Now, a man from Bethany named Lazarus was sick. Mary and Martha, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." Remember, Lazarus is part of that chosen family of Jesus. He visits when he can. So Lord, the one you love is sick. When Jesus heard this, he said, "This sickness will not end in death." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Then he said to his disciples, "Let's go back to Judea. Lazarus is dead." When Jesus arrived, Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Martha came out to meet him and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Martha went and called her sister, and when Mary came to where Jesus was, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw Mary weeping and the weeping of the Jews who had come with her, he was deeply troubled and distressed. Jesus wept. Some of the Jews said, "Couldn't he have done something to keep Lazarus from dying?" Jesus came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. So like this person saying, couldn't he do that? Martha, the sister of the dead man, said, "Lord, by this time there is a stench, for he's been there for 4 days." They took away the stone, and Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, bound hand and foot with linen strips, and with his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unwrap him and let him go." So in that story, when Jesus stands at the tomb, he is deeply troubled and distressed. If you read your, I should have told you, that's John 11, of course. So if you want to have that in the Bible open in front of you, that's great. Jesus is deeply troubled and distressed. And if you look at different translations, there'll be different renderings of those words. But one of the Greek words that's used there is splachna. It means guts, the viscera in a person. So that phrasing really in English is something more like his guts were in turmoil. He's so deeply moved. If you've ever felt that, whether it's anxiety or grief or something else that's that deep and your whole inner organs feel like they're twisted and quivering, that's what Jesus is experiencing. His guts are in turmoil. That to me feels like one of the most powerful descriptions of Jesus's emotional life that we have. And of course, the very next verse is he wept. So there's so much going on inside him. Tears come, and his guts are quivering. And what is he feeling that so deeply about? What would you say?
In the common English version,
Yep.
that passage, that verse says, when Jesus saw her crying and the Jews who had come with her crying also, he was deeply disturbed and troubled.
Yeah. Right. So what, at least part of that is he's witnessing the grief of the people around him who also loved Lazarus. And that leads to this. Are there other reasons you might think for that level of turmoil in him?
Did he wonder to himself if he had come too late?
Ah, right. Yeah, there's that strange part of the story that I can't explain where he hears that Lazarus is in trouble and then he waits 2 more days to come. Yeah, maybe there's, oh no, maybe I've done the wrong thing. It's possible. Any other reasons he might feel that deep level of turmoil that you think of?
Lazarus was his friend.
Right. Yeah. This is someone he dearly loves. And his friend is dead. This is, if we wonder, does Jesus get the blues? He witnesses the loss of life of one of the closest people to him in this story, yeah, I'm certain that that is part of the motivation here for feeling so deeply something is wrong. I also think it's probably true that just standing in front of a crowd mourning the death of someone, like that death ravages human lives and human communities, that may be a big piece of what he is grieving here. I suppose it could also be anticipatory grief because he himself will go through a violent death. And as we said before, maybe there's part of this buildup of emotion. We won't talk today about his crucifixion and all that leads up to it, but that's incredibly traumatic. And maybe the death of a close friend is something that feels like a prelude to that. I don't know. But if nothing else, we can say that Jesus, our brother, gets the blues, gets them in both senses, experiences the blues, the grief of life gone wrong, but also he gets in the sense of understands our blues and grief. Jesus weeps with the people who are weeping. There's a participatory nature here to his presence with this crowd of mourners. He's not standing off. And the beautiful thing is, this is even in the Gospel of John, which is again the one gospel where Jesus is more kind of surveying everything, connected to God all the time, more in control. But here he's profoundly moved, guts in turmoil level of moved. And that, I think, is to me, a hopeful, beautiful scene of God in Jesus participating with us in the griefs of the world. And then in another, perhaps, foreshadowing of what is to come, Jesus calls Lazarus to come walk out of his own grave. And he does. It's a wild scene. I mean, one reason I use the goofy Lego images is that last one where Lazarus has come out, he looks kind of stunned, like, what's going on? And of course, just try to imagine being Lazarus and then going back to your life after having been in a grave. It's a wild scene. But Jesus is both participatory, full participant in the grief, and then doesn't leave us in that state. Doesn't leave the people who love Lazarus in that state. And I think that is a foreshadowing of the end of Christ's whole ministry. God will not leave Jesus in that state of being in the grave either. And I will need to, on that note, go get ready for preaching here at Highland. But I'm really grateful for all of you joining the class. And if you would like to have more discussion next week, we will look especially at Jesus's compassion. There's a whole bunch of other emotional modes that he reveals in the Gospels, and we might have time to look at some of those, but especially compassion will be our highlight next week. Gerald, anything else we need to tell people?
Anybody have any questions or final comments?
Yeah. Thank you, friends. It's a joy to be with you. Go in peace.